Welcome to the Room to Bloom podcast, equipping you to live redefined, renewed, and restored. I'm your host, Julie Rebboah. Let's tackle this week's topic. Welcome to the Room to Bloom podcast. This week, I have special guest, coach and trainer Kristin Brock, and today we'll talk about resilience after adverse childhood experiences. And for anyone listening, we're going to find out what adverse childhood experiences are and how they might affect you into adulthood, and also to let you know that you can heal and increase from some resiliency steps. So, Kristin, welcome, and please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hi, Julie. Thanks so much for having me. I am a solo mom. I have 3 boys between the ages, they're 18, 19, and 25, 2 dogs and 2 cats. So anytime they may go scampering across the room during recording this. But I have worked in nonprofit management my entire adult life. And so I still run a small NGO, that's a small organization that supports an NGO in Uganda. But I also have an LLC, or my own business, that trains organizations on trauma-informed leadership. So I primarily work with nonprofits, and secondarily really trying to get into working with churches, because I think this is a really important issue for churches to understand.
I agree with you. So we're so glad that you're here today.
You.
So you are a trauma-informed coach, and can you tell us a little bit more about what that is exactly?
Sure. So it'll make more sense probably as we talk a little bit more, but I believe strongly in our ability to stop generational trauma. So we know trauma is passed down from generation to generation, and everybody always wants to work with the kids. And my specialty, for lack of a better word, is working with the adults. So we can't stop generational trauma unless adults are not passing it down to their kids. So in a perfect world, I'm working with adults, primarily parents, for them to understand their own stuff. And so they're not triggering their kids accidentally. We want to create thriving children, and we do it through the adults.
Well, that sounds like a great plan, and I can understand why you would start there. So why is it that you are so passionate about coaching others and helping them heal from their adverse childhood experiences, which sometimes we refer to as ACEs?
Sure. So the short story is my oldest son is a bio son. My 18 and 19-year-olds I adopted through the foster system. And that's a whole nother story, because the foster system, you're part of breaking apart a family, no matter what, when you're engaged in the foster system. But I went into that. They are both bio brothers, and I went into that adopting, knowing that I wanted to adopt them. Interesting piece of that and why I got involved in this. I have a master's in marriage and family counseling. I had worked in group homes. I had worked in juvenile detention centers. I kind of thought this was going to be a breeze. And once these boys came into my home, I had no idea what I was doing. It was so different than parenting my bio son. And I just really dove into why parenting them was so challenging and why their behaviors were the way they were, and learning how to understand that and how to parent them in order to help them heal.
Yeah, that's really important. You want to be there for kids in the way that they need it most. And so what are adverse childhood experiences? Could you tell us what those are exactly for listeners who may not have heard that term before?
Sure. So interestingly, ACEs came out of a study that Kaiser did, it's got to be 20 plus years ago. And they studied people who had something happen in their childhood between the ages of 0 and 17. So we're really looking at what happened when you were a child. There's 10 different things they look at, and then you get a score. So one of them might be, my parents got divorced. If they got divorced one time, you have a 1. Another might be, I saw my dad hit my mom, or there was violence in our home. Even if it just happened one time, you get a 1. So those add up to a 10. The higher the number, there are different outcomes for you as an adult. The way I like to describe it is we're really looking at toxic stress in kids. So there's a great video on one of the videos I share. And you know that feeling when you're standing on a corner and you're about to step into the street and a car comes zipping by, and just what happens to your body when that car zips by. What toxic stress is in a child's life, when their life is that car just coming constantly. They never have a breather. And so their bodies, all they know is just that constant stress in their lives.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So they're under continual stress. It never really subsides. And so, what does that toxic stress do to them?
Sure. So if we look at it from a scientific point, which sometimes gets a little clunky for people, but we have this thing in our brain called the amygdala. It's kind of like an alarm in our brain, and everyone has them. They go off. When they go off, we need a need met, some kind of need met. So if you've got a baby and the baby's crying because it needs to be fed, or it needs to be held, or its diaper changed. If that doesn't happen, then that alarm continues to go off, and if it happens enough times, it malfunctions. It no longer knows how to work properly. So a kid who maybe never got fed as a young child doesn't know a proper response to when a meal is going to come. And so I think it's important for people to know, like, it really does change brains. It's not just about, oh, they don't know how to behave, but our brains have changed when we are engaged in toxic stress. And there's a whole wealth of study on generational trauma, how it changes us enough that it actually changes at the DNA level. So we are passing it down to kids just by sense of, if we're not healed, we're passing it down through our DNA.
Wow, that's incredible. And in one way, I think it would be really relieving for somebody to know that, maybe all the times that they got in trouble at school, or they're not performing like their peers, that it's not, there's a
Yeah, it's not your
deficiency
fault,
with
right?
them. Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
That there are actual scientific reasons that
yeah,
this may have happened. So you touched on two different ACEs, and one was divorce and the other was domestic violence. For listeners, would you be able to tell us what some of the other ones are, just in case
sure.
they're wondering, like, gosh, what else might have affected me?
Sure. So I probably can't list all 10 off the top of my head, but substance abuse, a parent in prison, domestic violence, sexual abuse.
I know
This is
neglect is one also.
Yeah, neglect, somebody dying in your home, like a suicide, mental health issues in the home. So those are kind of the 10. I think what we have found is really interesting is that original Kaiser study was done with primarily white people. They were all employed because they worked for Kaiser. They all had their health insurance because they worked for Kaiser. They all were middle income because of that. So there has been a whole nother study around, what about those things that we don't address in that? So we don't address racism. We don't address lack of services. We don't address discrimination. We don't address poverty. So there's a whole new field of study that's looking at those additional things on top of just those ACEs that kids have.
So would that fall into the expanded ACEs category, those things that you just referred to?
Yes. Yes. And really what
Okay.
we're looking at is, beyond. So just looking at lack of services, if I live in a community that doesn't have a grocery store, I live in a food desert, it doesn't have a grocery store that provides fruits and vegetables, or I don't have easy access to counselors or therapies, or I'm not in a school system that understands trauma and how that shows up in kids. It's not just a kid behaving badly. They don't understand what's going on. All of those things add to that, our ability to be resilient.
Okay, so that the ACEs and the expanded ACEs impact a person's ability to be resilient in that moment, but
Yeah.
also in the future.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Okay. And so I guess we should just dive into, how do these experiences impact people long term into their adulthood? Because we know when they're kids, they'll act out, probably get in trouble. Some, lean towards perfectionism,
Yeah.
some lean towards attention seeking, but into adulthood, what does that look like?
Sure. So the really interesting thing that we found, I think most people would suspect, if you grow up in the home of an alcoholic, you have a more likely chance to become an alcoholic. If you grow up in a home where your parents weren't educated, which is not an ACE, you are less likely to become educated. So we look at those kind of big things that people assume, but the shocking thing that came out of the ACEs study is, I think the magic number is 4. If you have 4 or higher, the percentage of having cancer goes up. The percentage of having a heart attack goes up. The percentage of breaking bones goes up. So these things, it actually affects our physical health in ways that we never understood before. So it's not just those simple things like, oh, they grew up in this kind of home, so they're become this. but people's physical health, which is just the result of toxic stress in our bodies. We're learning more and more about what stress does to us. But if you're a child with this toxic stress continually, these are the percentages that just skyrocket. I've got some really interesting data that I won't go into it, that I talk about when I do my trainings, but it's quite staggering.
Yeah, I've looked at a little bit of it myself in my coursework, and it is staggering, as
Yeah.
you've said, and it's incredible how the environment can really shape not only our brain development, but also our physical health later
Yeah.
on from all of that toxic
Yeah.
stress. And so while these things are a possibility, like the increased likelihood of cancer developing or osteoporosis with the
Yeah.
bones breaking, and I know depression and anxiety as
Yeah.
well, these things are not set in stone.
Right.
We have the ability to change our outcomes. So that's the good news. So, how do we do that?
Sure. So I think it's really important to know first that I could have an ACE score of 10, and that just does not mean that I am automatically going to have heart disease and broken bones and cancer and become an addict. I can have an ACE score of 0, and it does not guarantee me that I'm not going to have any of those. So we take that, we look at percentages, but it's really important to know if you start looking into this and you go home and you research ACEs, you're like, I'm a 9, I'm going to die. That's not necessarily true. What we look at are resilience, ways to build resilience. So what the study did not take into effect is, was there someone in this person's life that was an important person? So it's really important to have somebody that you can lean on, that you can trust. Were there services in that community that kind of banded around that child? So we look at what are some of the different things that can enter a child's life. And then I think for me, especially with I'm coaching, once you understand, like, oh, this is why I am the way I am, you can start healing from that. There was a video, another one that I often share, and it's a mom who understood her ACEs. And she said, I realize now I grew up in a home with an alcoholic and divorced parents, and I ended up marrying an alcoholic, and I divorced this man. And now I recognize I just gave my child 2 ACEs. And so moving forward, I need to do something different. I need to figure out how to do something different. It's not magical, right? We don't just magically heal from those things, but understanding them is the first step in that.
Yeah, that's really important. Understanding is really key because it helps you understand not only yourself and why you've made choices or behaved the way that you've behaved, but it can also prevent you from passing any more
Yeah.
on to your own children.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly powerful. And so, one of the reasons I wanted to do this episode with you was to empower people, to let them know that even though this may have happened, it doesn't have to be your future or your
Yeah.
children's future as well.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
always say, particularly in the foster system, I think so many go into that thinking they just need love, but that's not necessarily true. Yes, they need that, but there's so much more healing that needs to be wrapped around that. You can't necessarily love a child out of trauma, and you can't love an adult out of trauma. It's going to take some work, but I always say healing is possible.
So, do you have any additional protective factors in addition to support and services that you can think of that might help diminish or prevent the long-term effects of that trauma?
Yeah, I think it's really just about those nurturing environments, right? And then getting the help when you need it. Therapy, medication, like all of those things can help.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. So, how can people really begin to increase their resiliency? Because I know that one of the protective factors that increases resiliency is also faith, spiritual health. Like
Yeah.
from what I've read in my own
Yeah.
studies, people with higher levels of faith have higher levels of resiliency to stress in their lives, and they
Yeah.
have healthier physical outcomes, mental health outcomes, emotional wellness, and so on.
So, faith to me is kind of the grounding that we can all go back to. I think it's really important, and I've experienced this directly with my kids, is that we can't just, I don't want anybody to assume if they're not healing that they haven't prayed enough or their faith is not strong enough. So, that faith is absolutely critical to finding that grounding, to finding that connection. I always say, raising these boys, I don't know how people who don't have a faith, don't have a connection to God, can get through it. My lifeline was I literally had a little group text. And when we were in the throes of something really violent, just pray now. I had my little group text, pray now. And then finding that for me, it was also about knowing how little control I have. So I'm educated, I'm smart, I've got experience in this. And God continually through this process taught me, you don't have control. You've got to let them go to me. I love them more than you love them. Let me have them. So I think that is so important to understand that balance between how critical our faith is, and don't let people tell you're not healing because you don't have enough faith. You're not praying hard enough. You're not, you're not having a family dinner. That's really important if you want to heal your kids. Guess what? All families don't look like that. You don't have to look like what the Christian family is supposed to look like. So a lot of it is giving yourself grace through this process for your own healing and for your kids' healing.
Oh, I appreciate you saying that, because I know that so many people believe in God, and yet sometimes they face other believers who lack understanding and awareness,
Yeah.
who sometimes unintentionally make judgmental statements and
Yes.
comments, not realizing that not everybody has the same family dynamics,
Yeah.
not everybody has the same life experiences, and not everybody's family fits a cookie cutter mold. And so I think that's really important for people to know that no matter what, it's not a matter of not praying hard enough, not having enough faith, maybe feeling punished like you've done something sinful that you haven't repented for. Like, this is not what it is.
Well, I think it's important too for churches to understand that. That's why I'm so passionate about training churches. I've got a couple stories of my own boys that just inadvertently, one, I won't tell the whole story, but one was a video thing they were doing, and it said, get your dad in the camera. You get 100 bonus points. Well, guess what? A, I'm a single parent. And B, their relationship with their dad is really traumatic. So for him, he just looked at me and shrugged his shoulders. Get a baby picture. We don't have baby pictures. They came in my life when they were 6, 7, and 8. So having other Christians, other churches understand that. Why does my kid wear his AirPods every day? Because that's the only way he can slow his brain down. He has to have a book on tape. And so as Christians, it's so important to not make a judgment on how families show up, on how kids show up. Ask the questions. Don't just assume it's bad parenting, or it's not enough faith, or it's maybe you should start doing a Bible study with your kids. That's not the answer for every kid and every family.
True.
I get a little riled up about that. And I always say it's never advertent. One of the things I continually talk about is we don't want to inadvertently harm, whether it's our kids or people in our community or members of the faith family.
Yes. I think asking questions is a much better way to deepen understanding before offering advice.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that. I'm sure your family and my family are not the only ones who have experienced inadvertent harmful comments.
Yes.
So if someone's realizing that they have a higher ACE score, where would you recommend that they begin as a place to start that healing journey?
Sure. So whenever I do these trainings, I always kind of give a caveat at the beginning, like a trigger warning. So if you are even maybe if you're listening to this podcast and you are just recognizing, oh my gosh, I have come from a ton of ACEs, things are starting to make sense, it can be really overwhelming. So the first thing I would say is give yourself some grace. Allow yourself to just breathe that in and recognize this is where I came from. I can't change this right now. And then moving forward, figure out who you can talk to. Allow yourself to process it, whatever way you need to process that. It could be anger. It could show up as sadness. It could show up as risky behavior. It could show up in any way. And not that I'm saying you should, you should go into risky behavior, but allow yourself to process it and then find somebody to talk to. So it could be a therapist. It could be a coach. It could be a dear friend who you say, I need to talk to you about something that I just recognized in my life. But finding community is absolutely critical to beginning that process to heal. I also say, cry out to God. be angry with God. Like he can handle our anger. I didn't have anything to do with this, God. Why? Why? One of my boys said once when we talk about faith, why should I believe in God who never took me out of this situation when I prayed for it? So wrestling with all those kind of things, I think it's okay. In fact, it's encouraged to just wrestle with what you've kind of discovered about yourself.
I know sometimes people are afraid to be angry with God, but what that truly is a real relationship,
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
If
look at
you're,
David, right? We look in the Psalms
yes,
and David cried out multiple times. He was so angry at his situation.
yeah, I often read the story of David, and his father in law was King Saul, and his father in law was always suspicious and he was accusing him of things that weren't true. He plotted against murdering him. I mean, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And it took time, but God did release him from that and he set him apart and made him a king. So the beginning is not always the end.
Yeah, exactly. That's probably the
Yeah,
greatest advice, right? Your beginning is not your end.
exactly. And so what would you say to somebody who maybe is bringing this up and psychotherapy or medication are recommended by their medical provider? How are those treatments in alignment with God's wish to heal his hurting children? And I ask that because, as we discussed earlier, some people feel that they're not walking in faith if they're taking medication, or they're not
Yeah.
walking in faith if they're seeking psychotherapy.
Yeah. So I always say God can work in many ways. So can there be miracle healings? Absolutely. But 99 times out of 100, we need some support. So talking to someone who is a professional who understands this and understands what you might need. I think therapy is probably less so of a we're Christians, we don't do therapy. I did have someone in my life who told me once, we're Southern Bells. Like we just push through. We don't do therapy. That's not what we do. So getting past that kind of hurdle of that. With medication, I liken it to sometimes our brains just need a little jump start, whether it's depression or anxiety, however that shows up for you. If we are a cancer patient, we don't say no to chemo because that's what we need to heal. And so God works in many ways, and that jump start you might need, or you may have something that's even more serious. You may be bipolar, you may be schizophrenic, all of those things. Medication is the way through that. I always say, particularly with depression, sometimes medication is the jump start you need to heal. Because as many of us know, if you are deep in depression, you can't even, it's hard to even think about wanting to heal. It's hard to even think about making the next step. You can't even get out of that hole. And medication will sometimes give you that ladder to get out of the hole to start to be able to heal. So I'm like, go for it. Whatever you need to take care of yourself, God is part of that.
Yeah, I agree with you, especially because some of these mental health issues are imbalanced brain chemistry,
Yes.
and sometimes medication can rebalance that. And other times, medication is temporary, just to kind of, like you said, jumpstart you and kind of
Yeah.
get you moving in the right direction. So,
And I'd give the caveat medication can be overprescribed, right? So you really need to understand or be able to tell the doctor, I don't think I need this, or this isn't working for me. My youngest was on medication, multiple medications for many, many years. He's now off all his medications because he's healed enough that he has them. But I do think for a while, they were, in a group home, they're going to over medicate kids. So
mm.
just find that balance of what works for you. It's okay to tell your doctor this isn't working, or no, I don't want to take that. It makes this side effect isn't good enough. So find that balance for you. No story is the same, and no medication is the same, and no therapist is the same.
That's true. Find ones that work for you and with you, because
Yes.
it's a partnership. It's not a
Yes.
dictatorship.
Yes.
Yes. And I also think, as far as psychotherapy or working with a coach, God designed us to be in community. And so we need other people. And
Yes.
I think that it is wise to seek counsel and help and advice from people who are educated and knowledgeable and also wise and discerning. And so that could also be spiritual guidance and mentorship as well. So I appreciate you, elaborating on all of those details for people who may have been offered medication or therapy in the past and were kind of wrestling with that, to give them a few more things to think about.
Yeah. And just like letting go of the shame, right? I think in all of this, whether you're a child from an adverse childhood, you had an adverse childhood, or you're a parent trying to do better, there's so much shame in the world. We put so much shame on ourselves. And that's the place you want to get. Like, there's no longer a need for shame as a parent, as a child. It's a hard thing to get over, but stopping that cycle of shame too, I think is so important. And finding somebody who can say that to you is really important, who can hold hands with you through the healing.
Yes. And so with that cycle of shame, sometimes we get trapped in it. And sometimes we still feel like we take responsibility for the things that happen to us as children. We think it's our fault, or we were told it was our fault. And as a result, we feel messed up and unlovable and unfixable. What would you say to people who are trapped in that?
So I would say it is so hard to get out of that, because if you've heard that voice your entire life, and that internal voice and some of your experiences continue to validate that. So if I hear a voice that says I'm unlovable, and I continue to make choices of men who can't love me, let's just say that's an example, then I'm kind of validating what I've heard, that voice. So I would always say, particularly if something happened to you as a child, you have zero control over what family you were born into, over where you were born, over the community that is around you. None of that was your choice. You were born into that. And so you have no control over that. What you do have control over as an adult is to start recognizing, I feel unlovable. I feel invisible. I think invisible is a really one. Why is that? And how can I start hearing what God says about me? I realize sometimes that can be, Jesus speak, because somebody can tell you, oh, God loves you, you're beloved. I don't feel that. I don't understand that. That doesn't resonate with me, even though it's true. And so it is a lot of work just to get those voices out of your head. And again, that's therapy, coaching, just crying out to God. I do not feel this way. And remembering it is not your fault, right? It's that parent thing when parents get divorced and they say, tell the kids always feel responsible. Like, there's nothing you could do, right? There's truly nothing you can do. And you may even say to yourself, well, I was a bad kid, or I was arguing, or nope, nope. The adults are responsible for the adult behavior.
Yes. Thank you so much for saying that.
That's not just a magic, oh, God loves me, so now I feel magically lovable. That it's hard work to stop those voices in our head that say that, and to start making choices that help us heal past that. I mean, There's a little bit of personal responsibility always as an adult, right?
Yes, absolutely. However, I have found that when one area of our wellness, let's say our spiritual wellness or emotional wellness, starts to improve, the other areas also start to improve. Yeah. Do you have any information about wellness and how an area can improve our overall wellness?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of going back to that hole that we're in. So whatever, and I always describe it as a hole, because when you are struggling with all of these things, it really feels impossible to get out. And so if you kind of use that ladder allegory, one step out, you can start seeing more clearly everything else. So if I am depressed and I get on medication, okay, maybe I can start eating better because I'm not emotionally stuffing, because I'm not depressed anymore, or I'm less depressed. Maybe I can start engaging with other people because I'm not so stuck in this hole. So that first step out of the hole, whatever it is, whether it's a faith journey, whether it's medication, whether it's talking to somebody, whether it's crying out to God, that first step starts making everything else more clear.
Thank you for explaining that. I like that ladder analogy very much.
I have been in that hole, so I can share from personal experience.
Yeah, well, that also gives hope that if somebody is just willing and ready and able to take that first little step, it could really launch them into a new phase of life and healing.
Yeah, and it's important to know it's not linear. It's not a straight line from here to there. It's a line that goes up and down, and sometimes it looks like a knot, and sometimes it goes backwards. Like that's all part of the process, is just moving forward, even if sometimes moving forward is backwards or in a knot.
Yes, and that's totally normal.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and for anybody who has struggled with their weight, you lose weight, you gain weight, you get sick, you gain weight, and it's just up and down. It's the same
Yeah.
way in all other aspects of our lives
Yes.
as well. So I guess that's where the grace comes in again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So do you have any recommended resources for people who might thinking they need more information or support to deal with their ACEs?
Sure. So there is a fantastic book called The Body Keeps the Score by Vanderkolk, I think is how you pronounce it. That book just really talks about what happens in our bodies. And so I think for a lot of people, it's important to know, like, this isn't because I'm doing something. Like, our bodies actually remember what happened to us and healing. There's a book called Trauma and Grace, bookshelf here. If you just research like childhood trauma, there are such a plethora of books. What I do find is there's not a ton of resources for people of faith that say, this is how God can heal me. But The Body Keeps the Score is really kind of a first step in understanding what's happening to you in your body and why you feel the way you do.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I know that there is a lack of resources out there, which is one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast episode today to help people learn about their ACEs and how they can start to move forward with faith as one huge tool in their toolbox.
Yeah, and I always say the caveat is, so any of us who have been pregnant, you read What to Expect When You're Expecting, right? And automatically our brains go to, oh my gosh, this is an ectopic pregnancy. Oh my gosh, I have this, because they tell you every single thing that can go wrong. So the caveat is, as you're reading this, if you start to research and start to understand yourself, just try not to go down the rabbit hole of all the negative parts of it. Just go into it as like, I want to understand this, because I think it may be part of your process. To sometimes, I'm a person who likes to go to the extreme of, if I lost my job, what would happen? What would happen to my house? I go all the way to the extreme, and I recognize, okay, there's nothing that bad is going to happen, right? Like I can work myself back. But that's the caveat. As you start unpeeling this, it can be really painful. It can bring up a lot of painful memories. And I would encourage people that if they start going down the path of wanting to research and understand, find somebody they can talk to through that process, because it can really be a lot. When I do the training, I always say, like, we use the word triggers, like, it's a trigger warning, right? Like, this may bring up a lot of stuff in you. And so make sure you have a safe space to process that, whether it's with a friend or a room where you can just scream and cry.
That's very good advice. It reminds me, and I'm sure everybody can relate when you have some sort of strange illness and you Google it. Google tells you you're dying and you've
Yes.
got all these horrible diseases, when in fact it may just be a weird cold or
Yeah.
whatnot. So
Exactly.
keep it in
Exactly.
context. So Kristin, do you have any favorite scriptures that could empower listeners today?
So my scripture this year is, and I'm not going to be able to quote it directly, is Exodus 14:14. And it's basically God saying, you only need to be still. And for me, I continue to learn the lesson of how little control I have. So yes, I can do all the things that I know I need to do, whether that's medication or my own therapy or coaching or, trying to make better choices. But ultimately, I have to hand that all to God and say, especially when I'm at the end of my rope, like, God, I just need you to take this, because I'm at the end of my rope right now. And the part where he says, be still, I just think for me, that is so powerful. Like, just let go of the striving, just be still. And he will be with you through whatever is going on, whatever chaos is happening in your home or in your brain. Just be still.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. And yes, we do need to remember to be still and surrender
Yes.
all of our hurts and our heartaches, because when we let go of that control, that's when God is able to pick it up and help us carry our burdens. Yeah.
And I think I said before, like, just somebody told me, God loves your kids more than you do. And so as we watch them, I mean, especially as they grow up and you they start to spread their wings, which is our goal as a parent, you got to let go of that, right? You got to let go of, okay, God, they are yours now. Guess what? They were always his, right? They were
Yes,
always his before they were ever mine.
exactly. I have to remind myself of that as well sometimes, that they belong
And
to
it's,
him. I'm just their caretaker.
yep. And it's important for us to remember too, we are his, right? We are his before, and it's so hard sometimes to get in our brain, but when you can get into that place of I am his, the verse in, I think it's Psalms, like he knew us, he intricately made us in the womb. Like that's really hard to fathom, right? It's hard to kind of think about, but if you can get to that space, we are his as well. It's really healing for me at
Yeah.
least.
Yes, for sure. Do you have any last words or suggestions for listeners today?
Sure. So I would just say give yourself grace. If this is the first time you're hearing this and it just put a light bulb in your head that said, oh my gosh, everything makes sense. Or if you are a youth group leader or a pastor and you want to understand more about this, because guess what? There are a huge percentage of people sitting in your pews, a huge percentage of kids in your youth group are kids that have come from trauma, even if they look like they came from the perfect home. And so the first thing I would say is allow yourself grace. If you're in a position of leadership, start to understand it so you can come to people with grace and with understanding. My goal, and I always say, like, my brother was helping with my website once and he said, what's your goal? And I'm like, to change the world. He said, okay, we need to hone this down, Kristin. But it really is about stopping generational trauma. And in order to stop that, we need to understand understand ourselves and how we can start healing so we heal the next generation. So find a way that you can start doing that, because we want our kids to thrive. Whether you are in a leadership position or you are a parent, we want our kids to be successful and thrive and not have some of the things that we had growing up.
Thank you so much for sharing those suggestions for listeners, because sometimes we are in leadership positions as teachers, as youth group pastors, leaders. We might miss some signs, but when we are more aware, we're able to pick up on things and realize that maybe that kid is acting out because of things that have happened, not just because
Yeah.
they're a quote unquote bad kid. They're
Yeah.
not bad kids.
Yeah. Or bad
Yeah.
parenting, right?
Right, exactly. So, Kristin, how can listeners find out more about your coaching services if they're interested in working on their ACEs or interested in having you as a trainer for their organization?
Sure. So my website is kristinannette.com, and I'm sure Julie will put that in the show notes. But that's kind of the core website, and that will direct you to coaching. It will direct you to my business where I work with nonprofits and churches. It'll also direct you to my podcast. So I have a podcast, Jesus, Justice, and Mercy. And I define it as where social justice meets theology. I'm also getting a master's in social justice and theology right now. So that's a huge passion of mine. And in the month of May, we're going to be talking specifically, it's National Foster Care Month and National Mental Health Month. So we're going to be diving a little bit deeper into these issues in that the podcast series in May.
Wonderful. I'm sure that'll be a great resource for people as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I will put all of those links in the show notes for listeners who are interested in reaching out to you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Kristin. Thank you for sharing all of your wisdom and your suggestions with us today. Such a blessing.
I appreciate you having me on. Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining me. I hope this episode has blessed you. If so, please subscribe, comment, and share. It's a great way to spread the love and keep good content rolling. As a reminder, this podcast is purely for informational and educational purposes only. Listening to content is not a replacement for medical or mental health care. Please make decisions with your personal care providers. Stay tuned for next week's episode. But if you want more content or free resources in the meantime, head over to FromBudToBloom.com. See you next time. Until then, live fully free in Christ.